I'm Peter Prove. I am Director of International Affairs at the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Switzerland. And in that capacity, I'm responsible, amongst other things, for our portfolio of activities in the field of peace building in a number of different locations around the world. Well, actually, probably the best starting point is to acknowledge the fact that when we speak of West Papua, we are talking about the western half of the island of Papua New Guinea. And that part of the island had been a Dutch colonial territory previously. And in the process of decolonization, through a series of events that are contested still to this day, it became integrated as part of Indonesia in 1969. And so West Papua now actually comprises or is made up of two Indonesian provinces, Papua and Papua Barat. The demands for a true and proper and legitimate referendum have only increased in recent years, given the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation for the indigenous Papuan people of the territory. The original population of West Papua is very distinct ethnically from the rest of Indonesia. They are Melanesian people. And as I said, very distinct from the rest of the population of Indonesia. I think that the perspective of indigenous Papuans on governance from Jakarta has deteriorated over a long period of time as a result of the persistent and quite serious human rights and humanitarian situation in the region, which the Indonesian government has frankly failed to address and to correct. If anything, the militarization of the Indonesian governance in Papua, West Papua, has exacerbated the perspectives of the indigenous Papuan population and has certainly served to increase separatist feelings and protests against Indonesian governance. It's not possible to, for example, conduct a referendum, which is one of the demands of the Papuan people, that there be a genuine, legitimate, and credible referendum of the Papuan population to determine what their attitudes towards the future political configuration in fact are. The Indonesian government, on the other hand, bases its position upon the original so-called Act of Free Choice, which led to the incorporation of these territories into Indonesia in the late 60s, which was in fact only undertaken by a hand-selected group of about 1,000 leaders or elders of the Papuan people who had been hand-selected by the Indonesian military. So understandably, the Papuan people do not consider that choice as being any sort of free choice and in any way legitimate or credible. Yeah, I mean, together with our partners in the International Coalition for Papua, we've been monitoring over many years now the incidents of human rights violations, particularly affecting indigenous Papuan people, have been. And what we've seen over decades is a persistently high level of very serious human rights violations, including extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, displacement, denials of freedom of expression and of assembly, and in general, a very gross, excessive use of force against people seeking to exercise their freedoms of expression and assembly. And this has been basically at persistently high levels. But what we've noticed in the last period, the last couple of years, especially during the COVID period, is that the incidence of serious human rights violations have actually increased, not decreased, as the government of Indonesia has been promising to do, but has increased during this period. Moreover, the militarization of the situation has increased. So Indonesia has deployed more troops in the region. They continue to focus on a military approach to addressing the issues, rather than one based upon dialogue and engagement with the indigenous population. Yeah, the World Council of Churches is a founding member of this network called the International Coalition for Papua, which started as essentially an ecumenical network, a network of churches and related organizations, but which now includes a number of quite prominent secular civil society organizations that work for human rights in the region or globally. Organizations like, for example, TAPOL, which is a very prominent Indonesian human rights organization. And together, the role of ICP is basically to monitor developments in the region, to provide reports on what is occurring, and certainly a flagship report, which is issued on a biennial basis that provides some sort of summary of the available reports and data that we at least have access to that demonstrate the severity of the ongoing human rights violations. Both civil and political rights and economic, social and cultural rights. But what the ICP also does is to undertake advocacy initiatives, in particular in key UN human rights forums and towards special procedures established by the UN Human Rights Council. Many of the organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and so forth, they have a similar perspective on the situation and in particular on the need for the Indonesian government to actually fulfill its promises to address this situation and to engage in a real, credible, authentic dialogue with the indigenous population of Papua. These are promises that have been made at the political level, but are unfulfilled. And the data that is evidenced in the most recent biennial report by ICP, unfortunately, gives tragic testimony to that. We've had many discussions with counterparts in Amnesty International and other leading human rights organizations and have sought to pursue similar joint initiatives, particularly in advocacy forums in the UN. And we expect that cooperation and collaboration will continue and intensify during the next period, given that, unfortunately, we envisage a further deterioration and escalation of the situation in the territory. This delegation visit in February 2019 comprised some 20 people, 20 international visitors, and it was the largest international delegation of any kind ever to have visited West Papua since it was integrated in Indonesia in 1969. And for example, in Wamena, we saw for ourselves, we met with a group of some several hundred, mostly unaccompanied minors who had had to flee from their villages, in some cases directly from their school classrooms, as a result of attacks upon their villages in nearby areas of the highlands, and were now being sheltered informally in a church compound in Wamena, and without any support, any humanitarian support from national authorities, Indonesian authorities, and in a context in which there is essentially no access for international humanitarian actors, which I found extraordinary. I can't think of many other cases where there is no international humanitarian access to people in that sort of situation, displaced people who are fleeing from conflict. Not even the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, has regular access to those territories, which I find absolutely outrageous. And I think it's something that the international community really ought to be pushing for to ensure that Indonesia allows more openness and in particular for international humanitarian actors to access the populations that are affected by the conflict. Those protests are often the focus and target of very heavy-handed Indonesian military and police responses. And many of the violations, many of the killings, many of the beatings, many of the enforced disappearances that are reported to us take place in the context of that sort of response to such protests. Indeed, there were very, very widespread protests throughout the territory of West Papua, but also elsewhere in Indonesia, about racism, the way in which some of these actions by the Indonesian government seem to be motivated by essentially racist attitudes. One of the other issues that has really mobilized protests is the application of the special autonomy law, which was a special legislation, a special arrangement created by the Indonesian authorities in, I think, 2001, which was supposed to provide for more autonomy and also significant funding for West Papua, for the communities of West Papua. But in fact, the opposite has occurred. So generally, the perspective of West Papuan people is that the special autonomy arrangements have done nothing to improve their socio-economic circumstances, have in fact been captured by an elite and has not operated in any way in their interests as a general population of Indonesian Papuans, indigenous Papuans. But in general, there are ongoing protests against the treatment by the Indonesian authorities of Papuan communities, and invariably they are themselves the subject of very serious, heavy-handed military and police responses. So it's not for us to say whether there should be independence or whether there should be what type of autonomy arrangement should be provided for. But what we are saying is that needs to be agreed between Jakarta and the Papuan people. And the Indonesian authorities most certainly need to address the long-standing, continuing, and escalating human rights crisis in the region, especially for the indigenous Papuans. And failing efforts to actually do that and to achieve an improvement in the human rights situation, it will only increase the calls for independence from Indonesia. So we are certainly calling on the Indonesian government to engage in efforts to improve the human rights situation, to address the humanitarian consequences of the militaristic responses they've been undertaking so far, and to engage in dialogue with the Papuan people.